Okay, great. I'm going to bring up the pointer. Okay, so I am going to talk more specifically about the need for an increase in the geographic range, the need to establish a metapopulation, as well as increase the US population size in the 10J management rule. So just to give you a broad overview of what the US Fish and Wildlife Service considers as kind of their framework or criteria for how to help achieve recovery of an endangered species. They look at what's called the 3 R's of recovery. So resiliency, redundancy, and representation. That means that that endangered species needs to be resilient to things such as threats or disturbances in their environment, things like climate change, habitat loss, you know, diseases that might be present. They need to have that resiliency over time. They should be redundant in population. So this kind of gets to one of the core aspects of what I'll be talking about in the need for more than just one isolated population of that endangered species to, again, be resilient over time to threats in their environment. There also needs to be representation within redundant populations of an endangered species. They should represent the full breadth of both genetic and environmental conditions to be recovered. And the US Fish and Wildlife Service also needs to use the best available science when they're defining the criteria for recovery of an endangered species. They need to address all major threats to their long-term persistence and viable populations, and then establish objective and measurable criteria. So this 10J management rule that we're talking about right now is basically the on-the-ground management rule for how to best implement the recovery of Mexican wolves. This, just to show you some of what the best available science has called for in comparison to the 10J management rule that was finalized in 2015. We know that for the geographic range, here number 1, the best available science has called for at least 3 core populations to establish that redundancy in populations. There should be one where the current area is, which used to be called the Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area in Arizona, New Mexico, as well as the Grand Canyon region and the Southern Rockies. Habitat in Mexico may contribute to the recovery, but like Roz just mentioned, Mexico is not actually held to the same standards as the US Endangered Species Act. And because of some of the habitat issues in Mexico, scientists have not considered that it would be likely for them to obtain self-sustaining viable populations over time. The 10J management rule that was finalized in 2015 really only allows for one population in the current Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area, where they're allowed to inhabit zones 1 and 2 and potentially disperse out into zone 3, but it restricts their range south of I-40 and again north of the US-Mexico border is what is managed by the US. Any wolves that would disperse out of these zones north of Interstate 40 would be subjected to removal. And so that puts them at risk. The best available science calls for the need for these 3 core populations to be connected through natural dispersal with at least one genetically effective migrant about every 2 generations, so averaged over 8 years. So a migrant would be a wolf that's coming, that's actually moving away from its natal population territory, so the area where it was born, and then it would move naturally to one of these other core areas, population areas in the Southwest. But the current rule says that they're not actually they're not really allowed to disperse or establish territories in suitable habitat north of I-40, and there's no natural dispersal ever expected between populations in the US and Mexico. There's only this one isolated US population that is allowed to grow into zones 1, 2, and 3, and artificial migration will be achieved only through releases from the captive population of wolves into the wild. The population size and trend in the best available science also says that there should be a minimum of these 3 core populations, and each one has a minimum of 200 wolves in each. So basically ranging in flexibility from kind of 200 wolves to up to 350 wolves. Overall, these 3 core populations should total at least 750 wolves, with their populations each stable or increasing over 8 years for Mexican wolves to be considered eligible for potential downlisting or delisting under the Endangered Species Act. But the 10J management rules placed a cap on the Mexican wolf population at 325 wolves in the US. So they wrote it into the rule saying basically this is a population objective of 300 to 325, but it is interpreted as an actual population cap because they give themselves all management tools available to remove wolves once they reach 325. So can you just imagine being a Mexican wolf 326 in the wild and all of a sudden you're removed for absolutely no reason other than you suddenly crossed an arbitrary population cap. I just wanted to put some visuals to some of that science that we just talked about and how that compares to what's in the management rule. So this is a map actually from US Fish and Wildlife Service's own models of suitable wolf habitat in Arizona and New Mexico. And you can see here from Roz's map that she showed, this is zone 1 here in the orange, and then zone 2, and then zone 3, and here's the I-40 Interstate 40 boundary. But their own models show all this additional suitable habitat that is north of I-40 up into the Grand Canyon region, as well as the Southern Rockies in northern New Mexico. And it just so happens that they stopped the modeling at the state borders, but we do know that there's also additional suitable habitat in southern Colorado and southern Utah as well. But again, they cannot cross wolves. Mexican wolves currently cannot cross I-40 to the north, or they'll be captured and removed. When we talked a little bit about that, the science calling for connectivity between these 3 core populations. This is from a published study that came out in 2014 that shows here, you can see these black lines. The thicker the black line is actually the stronger that corridor is for Mexican wolves, or wolves in general, as suitable habitat. So there are these 3 core populations, the Southern Rockies, the Blue Range, and the Grand Canyon, and you can see that they do have these important connected corridors that would allow for those genetically effective migrants to disperse from their natal populations into these other core populations over time. And wolves themselves have actually been following these dispersal corridors on their own. So we've seen, even since the very early years of the reintroduction program, going back to 2000 and 2002, there have been collared Mexican wolves that have moved on their own from the Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area, which is basically down in the White Mountains of Arizona, and they followed right along that suitable corridor that's the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, and following right up to the Grand Canyon region. And 3 wolves made the same dispersal journey just as recently as 2018. So these are 3 different collared Mexican wolves that all left down in this area where the current reintroduction site is, moving up along the Mogollon Rim. You can see here, actually this wolf right here, 1572, is my background photo. You can kind of see me floating in it. That's a photo of that actual wolf that was taken, not by myself, but by a woman named Michelle James, who took that photo on Highway 17, when she saw it before it actually was killed. And then this wolf here did cross I-40 and was on its way up to the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And this is the approximate area where it was picked up by helicopter capture and removed. So wolves are choosing to come on their own and disperse into these other regions. And there's been, over the last 20 years, there's a body of scientific literature that's been published showing that the Grand Canyon region and the Southern Rockies are excellent wolf habitats. So there's vast undeveloped areas. There's public land in both national forests and national park lands. There are ample food resources, such as elk and deer, for the wolves to eat. They are connected through corridors to the current reintroduction area. And the area just north of I-40, between I-40 and the Utah-Colorado state border, would add an additional 40,000 square miles of suitable habitat, and even more if we looked at the potential suitable habitat in the states of Utah and Colorado. And each of these core population areas could sustain at least 200 or more wolves. Another important aspect of the Endangered Species Act is actually recognizing that species should be restored for the ecological values they provide to the landscape. So it's not a matter of just restoring Mexican wolves for the sake of they're an endangered species, they need habitat to be restored and recovered long term. It's also a matter of restoring wolves back to their vital ecological role in the ecosystem. So both the Grand Canyon region and the Southern Rockies, we know, evolved with wolves as their keystone predator on the landscape. And so this is something that is largely ignored in the management plans by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The fact that these landscapes north of I-40 also evolved with wolves. And so this is something Mexican wolves need, and it's also something that these ecosystems need as well. So I just wanted to dive a little bit more into exactly what the court order said when Judge Zips found the 2015 management rule as insufficient to the long-term recovery of Mexican wolves. She actually had some very harsh criticisms of the 10-J rule, which included that both the population size and effective migration rate were misinterpretations of the findings of scientists. The Final EIS, which is that final 2015 10-J rule, actually wrongly assumed that the publications they analyzed effects on 3 populations connected by dispersal, and instead they took those findings and just kind of plugged them into one single isolated population, which is the current 10-J area. The court concluded that the population cap and the effective migration rate are arbitrary and capricious and fail to further the conservation of the species. And this is something that was in the judge's remand of the order, and she actually said this multiple times, that this 10-J rule was arbitrary and capricious. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's selected course of action would actually hinder the recovery of the species. So it's not just that it's going to further the recovery of the species, it's failing to do that. It's actually harming the recovery of Mexican wolves, and the agency's population objective and effective migration rate failed to prevent the long-term erosion of Mexican wolves' genetic health. So she also just further pointed out that this wasn't a matter of differences in opinion in the scientific literature. This is something that scientists have concluded that establishing a metapopulation, which comprises of those three core populations, at least in the US, is necessary to achieve recovery of the species. And although the US Fish and Wildlife Service acknowledges that territory north of I-40 will likely be required for future recovery, and recognize the importance of natural dispersal in expanding the species range, they just decided to impose a hard limit on dispersal at I-40, and any wolves that move north of I-40 will be captured and returned. So this is something the judge recognizes, and we recognize as well, that this is just a completely arbitrary boundary for wolves that makes no sense for, especially for an endangered species, but also for an animal that can range over such long distances. And so it's very easy for Mexican wolves to have, 250 square miles as an average home territory, and dispersing wolves can easily move up to 500 miles. So this boundary just makes no sense. So you might be wondering why, given all the best available science that we know that's been published, and the judge has found all these problems with the 10J rule, why did it get to this point? Why have wolves been excluded north of I-40? And it really comes down to just politics. So over the years, going back, there are plenty of documents that have shown the Arizona Game and Fish Department, which is our state wildlife agency in Arizona, has asked the US Fish and Wildlife Service to commit in writing to include the provision in the 10J rule to remove all wolves north of I-40. They also wrote what was called the cooperative alternative to the 10J draft EIS in 2014, and demanded removals of wolves once they reached that population size of 300. So basically everything in that cooperator's alternative was adopted in the 2015 final EIS. And then furthermore, the state agencies convinced elected officials to get involved, and by 2015, the state governors in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado all sent a letter to the US Fish and Wildlife Service saying no wolves north of I-40. So this is where you can come in and help. Right now, US Fish and Wildlife Service, like Amy said, is opened the scoping period for public comment, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that. But it's really important for people to weigh in and say that there should be no boundary for an endangered species, especially an arbitrary boundary at an interstate. And no wolves should be removed just for crossing that line on a map. They need to actively establish these two new core populations in the Grand Canyon region and Southern Rockies to help further their recovery over time. And there should be no cap or maximum number of wolves allowed in the wild. And so with that, I'm just gonna thank you for coming. I'm gonna hand it over to Chris to talk about some other provisions in the 10J rule.